Godwin is suggesting that the wealthy man, who gets to decide whether to be charitable or miserly, should start by recognizing that this wealth is not somehow a reflection of his great efforts and work, and that the wealth, in fact, paying for something is not somehow an act of equal exchange. To be wealthy is not necessarily to somehow deserve the power to decide whether to be miserly or charitable. The wealthy are simply people who are able to get other people to work for them. Now, what has this got in the midst of it somehow? It's got a theory about what produces wealth. And the theory in this case is that wealth comes from labor. And that's what it all boils down to ultimately. Why does this matter? This represents a huge break from previous thinking, philosophizing about the nature of value. And it shouldn't, don't associate it with Godwin because it's not his insight. Right? The labor theory of value comes from, no, not Marx. Well, Locke is responsible for the philosophical underpinnings of it. Adam Smith is the major proponent, the major figure who formulates this as a theory of value. Locke formulates it as a sort of moral philosophy. Adam Smith formulates it as a principle of economic theory. And we'll read some Adam Smith next week and see how he treats this. What was the preceding theory about the origin of value? The theory that Adam Smith was arguing against. Anybody know? Where else might you imagine that value or wealth comes from? Yeah. God. No. Pardon? Family. No. It's a good guess. No, not goods. Land. The preceding theory, which is known, it was espoused by philosophers who were known as physiocrats, was that all value came from the earth. And as you can imagine, this fits rather nicely with a feudal society, right? In which most people are engaged in growing crops or tending livestock. There is also a certain amount of activity associated with mining, but that could easily be incorporated in here as well, right? Because mining is also about taking something from the earth. It also fits rather nicely with a society grounded politically in control of land, right? Different feudal lords, the aristocracy, controlled land. In many ways, that land was tied to their families permanently. It wasn't just something they could sell, walk away from. And the idea that all of the wealth in a society came from land was a nice way of suggesting that it made sense for the feudal aristocracy to control the wealth, right? They control the land. The land produces the wealth, belongs to the people who control the land. This alternative theory that value comes from labor and not from land represents a big break and is actually something of a revolutionary idea at the time. It puts the origins of wealth not somehow just out there on the ground, but in the activities of the people working it, right? And by extension suggests that those feudal aristocrats aren't actually producing value. They are taking it from the people who work the land. Godwin's passage here is reflective of that larger kind of thinking. So, Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766 to 1834. So he was 10 years old when the American Revolution took place. He was 23 years old, just getting out of college when the French Revolution occurred and the American Constitution was ratified. He was the son of a free-thinking gentleman, a successful and prosperous man who was a sort of student of the Enlightenment. He was a gentleman, but he believed in the principles of the liberal Enlightenment era. He believed in science as an activity that was not to be controlled by the church, right? As an avenue to knowledge that was secular. He believed in the perfectibility of mankind, even as he was the child of privilege from an earlier social formation. So he sent young Thomas, actually known at the time as Robert, to Cambridge, where he studied mathematics, and he graduated and quickly became a parson. Everyone know what a parson is? What's a parson? A man of the cloth in the Anglican Church. Like a preacher, but I think parson is actually specific to Anglicanism. But yes, he was basically going to be a churchman, a parson in a small village in a parish, right? Being a parson was not an unusual occupation or choice for the child of the educated, well-off classes, right? It was a respectable position. It was not something you'd get really excited about. In some ways, it was where the well-off sent their less promising children, male children, right? You could get your education. If you weren't successful enough to become a professor, you could take your education because you could read Latin and you could sort of read the scriptures and so forth. You could take your education and go become a parson. It was a modest but respectable profession. Later on, after he had published the essay, he got a position as a professor of political economy, which he held for the rest of his life. And as I said, he was in many ways, by most accounts, he was the first professor of economics. Adam Smith was a professor of natural philosophy, not a professor of economics. The discipline of economics didn't really exist before Malthus, not as a separate institution. Who hired him to be a professor of political economy? Who paid his salary as a professor of political economy? Does anybody know? Yes? No, not students. It was the East India Company. The East India Company being what? The British-sanctioned corporation, private corporation. I mean, it was created by the British Crown to what? Set up trade in Asia. And eventually, it was the corporation that ruled India. At this time, it was in charge of India. And this was an obviously economic undertaking, right? To administer India was essentially to administer the agricultural production of the subcontinent in such a fashion as to enrich the East India Company, and by extension, the British, right? So that is worth bearing in mind. He was, in a sense, hired for that task. The first edition of the essay comes out in 1798, enlarged and revised in 1803. As I mentioned before, there were 6 editions in his lifetime. Okay, I think it's time for our 5-minute break, and then we'll be back. Okay. All right, let's look at the principle of population. Everyone did the reading, right? Yes? Yes? Okay, good. What are the components of Malthus's principle of population? It comprises 2 postulata. What is a postulata? Is it a kind of pasta? Laws. These are the premises of his argument. I believe this reflects his elaborate training in Latin, right? This is some like Latinate plural of postulate. Okay? First, that food is necessary to the existence of man. Doesn't sound like a postulate. Sounds like something that is trivially true, right? Or simply obvious and banal. Secondly, that the passion between the sexes is necessary and will remain nearly in its present state. Anybody have any problem with these 2 postulata? Anybody dispute them? Perhaps the passion between the sexes is unnecessary or is subject to dramatic change? No? Okay, so I guess we're sort of stuck. These premises look pretty airtight. Yes? No? Godwin would disagree.
He would say that our pursuit of intellectual endeavors would reduce our sexual passion.
Our pursuit of intellectual endeavors would reduce our sexual passion. Excuse me? Or increase our capabilities. But, I mean, Godwin wouldn't say that food is not necessary. He might, yes, I mean, and in many ways, the second one is up for dispute. I mean, he might say, in fact, the passion between the sexes is subject to control, right? People can learn to somehow deal with it.
Or that, like, in certain environments, the passion would be undermined, like in war.
In certain environments, like war, the passion might be undermined. Hopefully that's not what it's going to take, right? I mean, okay. We've got these postulata. What follows from these postulata? Malthus quickly goes on to describe what he characterizes as 2 opposing forces. And we've talked about this already, right? On the one hand, natural abundance, biological reproduction, the fecundity of humanity as an organism. Biological reproduction. And this type of characterization of natural abundance has a rich history in the Western tradition, particularly in connection with theology and theories about God's benevolence, right? Natural abundance resonates for Malthus and his readers with a notion that sort of divine providence provides for the natural abundance of the earth and people. This is evidence of God's benevolence, right? On the other hand, there is this opposing force of natural limits, which he wishes to describe and understand in terms of the production of food. So the passion between the sexes will lead to this natural abundance. On the other hand, food is necessary and it is scarce. The power of population is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man. Population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in arithmetical ratio. We talked about this before as well, right? Population is doing a 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 thing. Well, subsistence is just doing a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 thing. And you don't have to carry that out very far to get to a point where population is vastly, vastly orders of magnitude greater than subsistence, and you got your problem, right? Therefore, the principle of population itself is that there is a strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. This difficulty must fall somewhere and must necessarily be severely felt by a large portion of mankind. We're bumming, right? Now, this, what do you notice about this? Stated in this way, right? We've already seen that it's possible, at least at certain points in time, for food production, subsistence, to increase faster than population, right? We've established that. For, in fact, the period, roughly, since Malthus wrote this, to the present. We got 200 and some years of empirical evidence to suggest that he's wrong. Does that matter for this? Does that disprove this, as stated here? Yeah? No, why not? Well, yes, he's saying that the impacts of this are not going to be evenly distributed. But I'm not sure quite. I'm more concerned about this strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. We've got this historical period in which that appears not to be the case, or at least this notion that the geometric versus arithmetical disconnect doesn't apply. But does that disprove this? You got your hand up?
I was going to say the only check isn't the need to get food, but we also checks on stuff to conscious beings and as we get over knowledge and stuff to get.
Okay.
No methods of root control we understand.
Okay, so there are a variety of checks available to us. Yeah.
Seems pretty simple. If we remove the check, then we have disproved him so far.
Okay, if we remove the check by increasing food production faster than population, then we have disproved him so far. Did you have something? Okay. On the one hand, it's tempting to say, yes, it's disproved. He's wrong. We've got 200 years of empirical evidence to suggest that he's wrong. On the other hand, stated in this way, what could he say? Yeah. Well, that hasn't happened yet, or?
That it will happen. The portion that's going to be affected most is going to be the ones without.
Okay, that it will happen at some point.
Well, another issue comes up is not that there's not enough food, but the distribution.
Okay.
So that's what's gonna, like, the people who aren't getting the food are gonna be the ones that are getting check.
Okay, the people who don't get the food are going to be the ones who suffer the check.
He doesn't specify what a large portion of mankind is.
He doesn't specify what he means by a large portion of mankind.
Maybe not in that facet, but in the book he does. And that is the working class.
Okay, okay. We are quickly going to be thinking about who this large portion of mankind is and identifying them and thinking about them. The point I wish to draw here is that this principle of population is stated in utter abstraction from history, right? And he actually does a little experiment at one point where he says, let's imagine this for the world as a whole. He kind of dispenses, I mean, one possible objection is, well, sure, this might operate in principle, but what about if, there's really good agricultural improvement? This is another thing that's going on at the time he's writing, is tremendous advances in agriculture, tremendous efforts to improve agriculture by the application of science and technology. And that's another aspect of society. Somebody might say, well, what if we can, and he would say, oh, well, no, that's just maybe for right here, you can do that, but in the long run, you're going to run up against global limits, right? The amount of land on Earth is finite. You can't possibly hope to exceed that. So he's putting this together at a global scale, or rather, I would say just in abstraction from time and space altogether. So he can look at the last 200 years if he were alive today and say, sure, it may not have happened yet, but it's still got to happen eventually. Because this is actually a principle derived from abstract universal truths that are, as I said earlier, airtight, or they look airtight. So he has got an argument that is essentially immune to empirical evidence. He could also point, if he was alive right now, he could point to the billion-plus people in the world who don't have enough food to eat, or who are scraping by. He could point to places where infant mortality is very high, people die of preventable diseases. And he could say, there you go, there's the evidence right there. There are all kinds of checks operating. There are people who are suffering. And this is because of this principle, which is just universal natural reality law. It's a condition of humankind.